Awesome. So these chords are all triads. They're 3-note chords built in thirds. So we have C, we skip D, we add E, skip F, add G. And that add, skip process is used to create all of these chords. Those are how you get the chords to scale. If you haven't seen my playlist on harmony for composers, I recommend checking it out. Now, a sus chord simply says, let's get rid of the third and instead add either the fourth to get a sus4. Another option is to get rid of the fourth, get rid of the third, and instead replace it with the second. There are lots of different ways you can use a sus chord. One of my personal favorites is something I'll call a heroic cadence, which is the idea where you are going to end with one of these little combinations. And the way we would do that is we would just basically break this down. We would chop this up. We would say replace the third with the fourth, then move to the second, then our triad. It's a very common cadence. Another option is, first let's fix all this. So what we'll notice is that there are no notes between C major and D minor. We also know that when two notes share a note in common, you can actually create smoother voice leading. So between these two notes, we have a note in common, and between these two chords, we have a note in common. The only two chords that have no notes in common are C major and D minor. So if we want to, something we can do is we can replace the F and just have this little G hang over so that we get a D sus4. If we break this up, we'll see that we have a D sus4, which does have a note in common with C major. So now we have, which is another very common kind of strategy, especially if we have that in the top line. And this is what's called a prepared suspension. Prepared suspension. All right? And the idea behind a prepared suspension is that we use a sus chord, but the suspended note, in this case the fourth, is prepared by appearing as a normal chord tone in the previous chord, as a way to take two chords that have no notes in common, and so you prepare it by just having the sus chord appear to help branch the two together. Because these two chords have G in common, and then of course these two chords have, if we split this into two, have, of course, these notes in common. So that's another way to use sus chords. Then the last purpose that we'll talk about today is just added emotion for sad music. All right, so if we switch this from a major chord progression to a minor chord progression, let's do A minor, then we'll do D minor, then we'll do A minor again, then E major. So we have our chord progression. A nice kind of dark quality. What we can do is instead add a little bit of emotion to this by taking our initial C, turning it into a 2, and then raising this whole thing an octave. So the 2 is technically also the 9. So we have the 9, meaning if you take the 2, raise an octave, you get the 9th. If you're confused by that, again, I would recommend checking out my playlist, Harmony for Composers. I think it's like a 10-episode playlist, and it starts with the very basics of harmony all the way to using advanced, kind of creative, crazy kind of harmonies. It's a very useful series, if I do say so myself. But we have this kind of added, if we voice lead everything else, let's voice lead everything else. We have this kind of added emotional element to the chord progression. And then let's raise these actually an octave, shall we? Or we'll take these. If the first chord is open spelling, let's just make the whole thing open spelling. And that first little note, just starting on a sus chord, is a great strategy for just getting a lot of emotion out of it. But yeah, so that's kind of like a quick crash course on sus chords. It wasn't really prepared. That's just me going off the top of my head. Hopefully it was helpful.